I'll just go right into this book I was reading, and we talked about this now and again. And it's a very very large book. It's an expansive book, a lot of research. But I found this book fascinating because, so just for the record, it's titled "The Sword and the Shield: The Mitrokhin Archive: The Secret History of the KGB." So, just a bit of background of Vasily Mitrokhin. He was a agent in the USSR. I believe he was an officer, and he was in charge of these archives. And over the course of, I think, maybe 30 years or so, he was just copying over what he was going through. So he had to sort through all of the old records and archives and memos and letters gathered by the KGB. And just to start, I'm going to preface this by saying we're going to use the term KGB as a catch-all to refer to the broad organization that existed over the course of the 20th century, and it went by different names at different times. Early on, it was known as the Cheka. In the early 20th century, the secret police. Then there's the NKVD. There's all these different departments that event and became and got merged and changed their titles. And so when we say the KGB, that was like the late term thing, where because they had the archives and everything. So if I say KGB as shorthand, it might refer to one of these. It's like when you talk about the CIA, at a certain point, it would have been known as the OSS. But I'm just going to say CIA because you know what it fucking means. Um, but it's really interesting. So this guy worked, and he was copying all these archives and smuggling them. And there's a story early on of how he did this, and eventually, made them go public. And so these archives number in like the tens of thousands. And this book was based off of those archives and weaving them into a story. And this story starts at the very, very early stages. It starts with Lenin. It starts with Trotsky, and it goes right up until the end through Khrushchev and everything, and right to the fall. And so it's meticulously documented stories of spies. Specifically, what the book endeavors to do is talk about the KGB and the operations of the USSR internationally. So it's not so much about the day to day in the Soviet Union. It's about their special actions and their missions and everything they were trying to do throughout Europe and North America. And that's kind of where we would start with this, and about how when people talk about the KGB, they might think of kidnappings, assassinations. Well, there was a lot of that. There certainly was. The key of the KGB wasn't so much assassination as much as it was subversion and creating false truths. And the most interesting stuff in this is about how they did that, which we'll get to in a little bit. But the false truths was how they countered dissidents and leaks. So early on, like if there was ever a leak of what they were doing, they had this entire all these mechanisms, a galaxy of mechanisms to sow doubt into the validity of that leaker. And sometimes it would be attacking the individual by attacking their credibility, attacking their lives and what they say, whether they're a liar, or putting out other false information to create this fog and just kind of get the true stuff lost in there. So that's what's interesting. We'd always talk about this, about how there's never a situation where anyone ever admits what they were doing was wrong. And this is where the term conspiracy theory comes from. Conspiracy theory is a weapon. It's utilized by the CIA, but also by the KGB to create enough madness around the truth that no one even wants to dig through it. They just say everything in that cloud is crazy, and everyone who's associated with it, it's like, oh, and that's where they would go after personal history. Is like, oh, this guy leaked some information, but do you know he was having an affair? Do you know? And back then it'd be like, do you know he was a homosexual? Oh, they would do that, a lot of that. And what's interesting, oh, by the way, you can jump in here if you want at any point I make. But what's interesting that you notice, Marxism as an ideology predates fascism, not by much, but around 40 years. I think I discussed this before, but I only say this to establish that they were fighting nationalism and fascism before fascism existed. So even Marx, like, even because I'm reading Capital by Marx right now, and a lot of the early stuff is still talking about the destructiveness of nationalism, and they talk about the bourgeoisie, but nationalism as an idea, as a tool of the bourgeoisie. So early on, early 20th century, late 19th century, they're already infiltrating nationalist groups, and this is something to be important. Like I think Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug. You know, I've listened to some of his stuff, and he made a point that I'm sure has been made before, but he's like the right is merely the absence of the left. So the idea of nationalism predates Marxism. Obviously, Marxism was created to attack and destroy that. So early on, as prior to the USSR, during these revolutions, they were still trying to infiltrate nationalist groups throughout Europe. And this is what we saw in the Weimar Republic, even that there was communist forces in there, in Malaysia, all over the world, trying to like this new idea, because it used to be a new idea. But just to establish that they always struck first. They were the instigators. They were a lot of leftists and Marxists these days look at America as the ultimate imperialist power. My thesis here is if you look at the history of the USSR and the Soviet Union, they were possibly the most imperialist nation on earth throughout the 20th century. Now you can argue America is what it is now, but everything America's doing now to undermine politicians, undermine movements, all that stuff was done by the USSR. They literally tried to subvert nations through not only these movements, but also assassinations and military action if they were in close proximity to them. But it's funny that there's one thing here. By the 1930s, they were already infiltrating the West. Their main targets, during World War II, their main target was Britain. And the argument that was made here was that that's kind of how Hitler got the drop on them, because they saw the United Kingdom, which makes sense, as the leading imperialist power in the world. The British Empire. What is more imperialist than the British Empire? So the argument was, I'm not going to get into a World War II thing, but the argument was that he kind of had Hitler in his blind spots, that conflict, even as Germany was amassing troops on the border. And there's evidence that Stalin was being informed that here's what Germany's, they don't like you. He's like, no, don't worry about them. He was convinced, because he had spies in the British society that were feeding them information, and he had spies all over the place. He was saying, no, that's just the idea that Germany is doing this is a British trick, because the thing that defined the USSR and the KGB was heightened paranoia. And the reason that happened was because even going back to Lenin, Stalin was big on this, but Lenin was convinced that what they were doing, this Soviet experiment, this new thing, was so revolutionary that it was impossible that war would not happen. War has to happen because they're brushing up against these forces that they assume are going to be so adversarial to them that war is inevitable. So a lot of what they were doing was predicting that eventually they're going to try and destroy us, so we better strike first. So by the time they were infiltrating American and British and French, a lot of French stuff, spies were in there. There was nothing like that going on in the Soviet Union. They weren't sending spies, or they didn't know any of this shit was going on, which is kind of interesting. But there's a quote by Stalin here, just to establish this. This would have been in the 30s. Sorry, just getting over here. So the quote is, this is by, actually, no, this wasn't by Stalin. Actually, was it? Yes, this is by Stalin. We are living not only in a state, but in a system of states, and the existence of the Soviet Republic side by side with imperialist states is in the long run unthinkable. But until that end comes, a series of the most terrible clashes between the Soviet Republic and bourgeois states is unavoidable. So this was the mantra that went through everything they were doing, that they were like, there's going to be a war because what we're doing is so good and they're so bad and evil that whatever we cannot subvert, we're going to have to destroy. This was, again, established pretty early on.
Right.
And then this, after, I won't go into too much about what happened after World War II, about how they subverted Eastern Europe, but in short, a lot of it, they kind of go in through the security side and try and infiltrate and things like that. But one interesting thing was there, a lot of these revolutionaries, and this is mirrored almost to a T by the Weather Underground, because the Weather Underground, as we've covered before, was a leftist Marxist revolution that in the 60s was trying to, happen in America. It was bombings, it was kidnappings, it was shootings. We cover that in our Days of Rage book report. I don't want to call it a book report, but it is what it is. And we talk about that. But they were very attractive to students and homosexuals and women. because, and this is something that a lot of people understand about Marxism, but and we'll cover this a bit more once we talk about Marx's Capital. But the way they see society structured is that everything, they look at it like a pyramid. At the bottom are the workers, and then everything above that, including military, government, religion, any defining ideology, is specifically created and maintained to oppress the workers. And this would include any elites, any aristocracy, anything like that. So it's
Yeah, yeah.
workers
It's
against everything else.
conflict theory, right? It's the idea that whenever there's a difference between two things, that only exists because those two things are at odds and must try to destroy each other at every
Yeah. Yeah.
opportunity. Yeah.
But early on, what they found was as they were trying to start these movements, so they would install what they would call illegals, and this was like the official name, illegals. So they might have their embassies in these countries because they're a country, you have embassies, but you would also put these illegal citizens in their country, spies. They were spies. They were paid for by the Soviet Union, but their goal was to start these movements in these countries and recruit people to gather information, but also perpetuate these movements. And a lot of them, like today, start in schools. I remember there was this quote by this guy. What was his name? Arnold Dutch. So he was an illegal. He was part of what they call the Magnificent Five. So these guys early on in the Soviet Union, they were seen as, I'm trying to think of an example other than the Avengers, but they were like, if this was America, they'd be the founding fathers. These were like the most famous spies early on. Like they were the ones who infiltrated, who did such a good job recruiting. All right, so we lost connection there for a moment. So before we go to the next part, we lost this section. And so I'm just going to repeat it now just to wrap up that part. So the quote was from this man named Arnold Dutch. It was, given that the communist movement in these universities is on a mass scale and that there is a constant turnover of students, it follows that individual communists whom we pluck out of the party remain will pass unnoticed both by the party itself and by the outside world. People forget about them, and if at some time they do remember that they were once communists, this will be put down to a passing fancy of youth, especially as those concerned are scions of the bourgeoisie. It is up to us to give the individual a new political personality. So the point was that they were interested in these already subversive people to try and recruit. Now, why were they trying to be recruited? Well, because their minds were already open to new ideas. That's essentially why you go to post-secondary education. They were not only open to new ideas, but they were trust fund kids. They're the rich kids. They're the bourgeoisie. They can pass undetected. So you're not approaching them as they might think because they're the cutting edge of academia. They're the future geniuses of the world and possibly of this movement. No, they're actually going to them because it's a good plausible deniability, and also they're open to new ideas. That's why these new radical ideas take such a hold in these, not just academia but the student body, because I think it's important to divide between the people who pay to attend school and the people who perpetuate school with studies and research and the actual lectures. And it's full of people. It's full of people who want to change the world. Now, they might want to change the world for the better. And as Marx has said, the reason he's doing what he's doing is to change the world. That's what the communists are trying to do, is change the world. So there's lots of many ways people want to change the world, and with different motivations. And what they were good at was gathering all of these world changers despite their motivations. And you know what, it was actually quite palatable, especially if you imagine any college or university you went to, how many of these people with the egos that they want to change the world and destruct everything, how many of them just want to smash multiple parts of it? How much of society do they want to smash? I've known people, the types of people that these agents might approach, and they want to smash a good chunk of society, like more than half of it. So they can actually be convinced to go for the other half. It's very easy. If you want to destroy half of society, they can get you up to 80%, but it's hard to go from 0% to 20. All right, sorry. Yeah, we guess we lost connection there for a second. I was talking about, I think the last thing was about how the Soviet, how anti-religion the Soviet state was. But they did this funny thing. So they hated religion. Lenin hated religion. Marx hated religion too. So did Stalin and everything. You know, they famously called it the opium of the people. But one interesting thing was they still wanted to utilize that on a global scale. So after in the USSR, a lot of churches are being closed, but they still kept some priests around because they created this international group, almost like an NGO, called the Christian Peace Conference, and they created a few things, which is like we are trying to, we're going to be the voice of Christianity, and their Christianity, what they constantly talked about was racism. This would have been back in the fucking 30s and 40s and shit.
Yeah.
This would have been like as they're coming, like, so if you're wondering why like so many Christian organizations have racism involved, like this was a purposeful thing to not just undermine it, but to undermine the West as this hub of racism. And there's this funny interesting story, this book about this not Soviet, but like a communist school teacher named Bella Dodd. And her story was she was a school teacher, and then she asked too many questions in a way, and she was put on a show trial, and the things they accused her of was racism. And there's nothing to ever imply that or anything, but this is just to establish that the KGB and the Soviet Union in general, they were leveraging racism like 100 years ago as just a cudgel to go against the West and to use it against anyone. It's just a thing they could make up, and that's why it was so useful to them. And we kind of, a lot of conservatives on the right complain about that now, about like, you're just accusing me of racism, you have no evidence of that, but it's enough. And they really were pioneers of that, of putting racism front and center and using that as this sort of the specter that you could just use against anyone, and everyone hates it. So, well, oh my god.
Yeah.
But and their entire, what they didn't really call it racism at the time. I think the term they used was racial chauvinism, which sounds, I want to bring that back if I can. I like that. So another thing to remember, so like KGB, like Marx is quoted as saying this, that the goal isn't to interpret the world, the goal is to change the world. And that's what Marx is all about. That's what Marxism is about. It's about creating a new world. And he thought just constant philosophizing and trying to interpret and find truth was a waste of time. And that still is very prevalent in the leftist paradigm today. It's all about change. It doesn't even, you're wasting your time if you're trying to understand things. Fuck it. You don't even need to understand it. You know, I know it's bad and I want to change it. And they'll boast about this. This isn't a claim I'm just making. But this is why they had what they called special actions. So special actions were the missions they would take in service of changing the world. That's what they do. And this could be anything from assassinations. It could be later on in the story of the KGB and the USSR. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. What they started doing was sabotage. So early on, it was stealing documents, converting people, not so much blackmail, but, you know, spy stuff. But then later on, once the spy stuff started drying out, they were just like, okay, maybe we can start sabotaging power grids. Like they had a lot of, they were mapping out dams that they could blow up. This was in Canada. They had a lot of interest in Canada for that reason. But yeah, so that was them. They were kind of the pioneers of that in itself. And the one thing that I noticed, a common thread between all this stuff, the information they were getting from the West, again, from like Britain, France, America, a bunch of others. They had a lot of stuff in South America going on as well. They had a lot of information coming in, but where they fucked up, according to the book and a lot of other historians, was interpreting the information. The big roadblock they had was as time went on, they didn't really know how to engage with outside the USSR. So an example was, you know, they'd be getting information, then they would say, oh, that's fake information because that can't be true. That's insane. And then when they would try and implant propaganda, they overreached. And that's why, okay, so here's an example. One thing that they and this is documented, they tried to do was to turn everyone against, I think it was J. Edgar Hoover. So what they were trying to do was they were really trying to forward this idea that he was a homosexual, right? And he might have been, but the KGB, there's evidence that they were trying to start more of these rumors. And not only was he uh, a homosexual, but according to them, he was trying to turn the entire government into homosexuals. He was trying to use all these gay guys and recruit them for his own private means. And the story they were putting out there was that the, the this was leaked by a high-ranking KKK member. So the story they crafted was that like a fucking grand wizard or something in the KKK was trying to we're trying to bring down the government by it's like they don't know America, so they don't know how dumb that sounds.
Yeah.
The idea that the KKK would infiltrate the CIA, who's trying to fill the CIA with gay guys, like they sent that out. They tried to get that in the newspapers, and the story just fizzled. But what it wasn't the mechanical or informational infrastructure they had. It's just that they couldn't tell the stories right, and they misinterpreted information, and there was a lot of stuff that kind of fell between the cracks. But that was a cultural thing. And the funny thing is, as the 20th century progressed, they had a harder and harder time recruiting. So here's what happened: a lot of the time, early on, the strength and the power and the charisma of the Soviet Union was, and the propaganda and everything was, it was easy to get people involved. So, and they would recruit from the USSR, send them to a special school for like years sometimes. You learn English, you learn everything, and then we'll send you over to America, and you're going to start the movement there. This became more and more difficult, not only logistically, but culturally, because they knew less and less about America, because American culture was becoming this big, really weird, fucking complicated thing. And, by the 50s, it was like night and day between America and the USSR. So they had to start recruiting from America. And near the mid 20th century up until the end, like the most of their spies were just American recruits, which presented its own problem, because these were the recruits, like we had said, they were the student types who had, by definition, they have their minds open. So they loved Soviet propaganda. People in the Soviet Union were liking the Soviet Union less and less. But the only ones who bought into it were Westerners. And then they would sometimes go to
Bernie Sanders of the world.
Yeah, they would go there. They'd roll out the red carpet like North Korea does. Like, look at all this amazing stuff. And then there's stories of people who lived there for a long time and who wanted to leave too.
And this, for the record, this is what China is doing right now with the what is it, the Confucius Institute, where they're whining and dining people. All the China did nothing wrong professors and sending them back to fucking ACLU.
Yeah, and that's interesting, and they did the exact same thing. It's not surprising because China. It's interesting because China doesn't come up a lot in this book or in the archives, and I'll get into this in a second. But the funny thing is, in similar stories that they were really trying to, if not create, but at least put a lot of rocket fuel into, was that the American government invented AIDS. You hear that a lot. You hear that like,
well, yeah, because it's true.
A lot of hip hop guys really like the USA, American invented AIDS. The Soviet Union was helping purport that. And what they did, they had a whole network and a whole infrastructure where they would contact conspiracy theorists. So what was happening, Solzhenitsyn was a big deal for them, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago. So when Solzhenitsyn and some other high profile guys were leaking shit, they had to counter that. So what they would do is they would send stuff to conspiracy theorists. They would do two things. One, they would have sympathetic authors, just Westerners, guys who write books who might be sympathetic, to write positive books about them, just to counter that. But then also reach out to conspiracy theorists and feed them conspiracies where the American government was the perpetrator. Now, I'm not saying all conspiracy theories follow this, but they were trying to create this fog of chaos and create this sort of disillusionment and dissent in the population. And, I'm not trying to say conspiracy theorists are like wrong in this, but you can imagine they would be the prime target for disinformation, especially if they're getting a little bit of extra money too. If they're getting, it's an and these guys are great at fabricating internal documents. They would fabricate false memos all the fucking time. And the other funny thing is that in the book, they talk about McCarthyism. So people know McCarthyism, like the Red Scare, as they call it. But internal documents from the KGB show that the Red Scare really fucked up their ability to recruit spies. They were actually really pissed off because McCarthy was saying they're spies in America. We have to find them, and everyone's like, "Oh, you're overreacting." While the Soviet Union is saying, "Fuck, this guy's making it really hard for us to recruit spies."
You can't just walk into a university lecture hall anymore and say, "Does anyone want to become a spy?" No, you can't.
Well, yeah, it's like the funny thing was there was that movie Trumbo that came out a while ago,
Yeah,
based
yeah,
after the
yeah.
guy Donald Trumbo, and I think I never saw the movie, but I saw the trailer, and it seemed that the story was about American government overreaction, and it's a big guy against the little guy. But what
Which
they
is so
don't mention
stupid
was
because Trumbo was a fucking communist.
he was a card carrying member of the Communist Party in America.
Yeah. Oh, they
And so it's like,
destroyed
hey,
his career. Yeah, he was a fucking communist. They should have hung him.
and what he did was he wrote a movie about it. It's like, yes, but it was accurate. You can blame McCarthyism for maybe being what we might call bad optics, but it was there, and it really fucked up the Soviets from being able to recruit, because at that point they needed people who were from America, could speak the language in a cultural context and not go overboard. And by that point, their ideological frameworks were so different that you wouldn't even know. Really, even meeting a Russian this day is like meeting another type of guy. It's very
Yeah.
There's a very specific Russian personality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but one thing I wanted to say about the whole conspiracy theory thing that I just mentioned was to point out how easy this is to do. You don't need to pay off that many people to get a story out there. And the modern parallel will be modern journalism. And if people have noticed that as you're reading these articles, if you still read mainstream news, read an article from the top to the bottom, you're seeing a lot more expert say. And what is an expert? You know, an expert could be anyone in the field. I'll give you a great example of this. And you'll know who I'm talking about here. There's this woman that we used to know when we first moved to Toronto, and we met her while we were working as door-to-door salesmen, and she's Romanian. And she was going to University of Toronto, one of the top universities in the world, for anthropology. And she's a nice girl. I have nothing against her. We fell out because she was really going down that sort of, at the time, SJW, you know, cutting her hair short, very into this very strange arena of feminism. But she came to me one time. She was in anthropology. You know, anthropology is the study of peoples and their history and how they move and everything. And she was going for a doctorate, I believe. But she was telling me about this article she had read from an expert. And it wasn't even a study or anything. It was this theory. The theory was, as she was describing it to me, that the reason women are shorter than men on average. By the way, she was taller than me. She was a very tall woman.
She was huge.
She was thin. She was thin but tall.
Yeah,
like I could see like a ballerina or something.
Like
but
a rake, yeah.
Yeah, but she was saying the reason women are shorter than men was because during dinners throughout history, which already doesn't make any sense, but let's imagine a family dinner. The man would eat first, the woman would eat last. So she was saying that, because the women got scraps,
Wow.
that they evolved over, I don't know, I guess hundreds of years
This
to
is
become
that same conspiracy theory Occam's razor shit again. Like, there are so many other, not proven, but like more legitimate, sense-making biological explanations for that. I mean, sexual dimorphism isn't a human thing. It's an animal thing. It happens everywhere.
Yeah. But here's the thing. So she was going for a master's degree. She would be quoted as an expert. And she read this in a magazine that looked just glossy enough to be treated seriously. But now she's an expert. And this was based off nothing. It's not fact. It's not a study. It's just this hypothesis that might make sense based on nothing. But because she's an expert and she's talking about it, now that becomes expert say. And maybe that article was planted. Maybe you paid a guy $50 to write it. Who knows? But that's how and that's to show you that when they say, they're controlling the media and trends, like, you only really need to pay off a few people, maybe 3 or 4, to destroy a conversation, but to create a conversation, you might need a couple more. But it's that easy. And so when you look at journalism now, it hasn't gone better. They're still talking about experts and sources and research, and studies show. What's the study? There's some. No one read the studies. And another thing is, I have just a bunch of notes here of stuff that I picked up that I thought was just fun to talk about. So in East Germany, at the partition of Germany on the Soviet-controlled side, they had these things. They had spies, right? But at this time, they had what they called Romeo spies. That's what they were officially called. So it sounds like what it is. This would be like the James Bond type, the one whose your job is to seduce this woman who's a high importance. So that might be not a ambassador, but maybe the secretary to the ambassador, and you seduce her, and then they figured out that you couldn't just sleeping with them, doing one night stands wasn't enough. And this is the kind of the cruelty of it. You had to make these women fall in love with you. And then over time they would probably slip up, reveal stuff, pillow talk, whatever. But you had to have like an ongoing relationship. But the the official name for it was the Secretary's Offensive. Like, it's not just like women, it's like, no, we're going after these lonely 35-year-old secretaries, and you'll be a young, attractive, exotic foreign guy. It's like, so you're going after spinsters.
This is interesting because it's kind of what I was talking about earlier when you're saying Ezra Levant's trying to convince people that China has troops on the Canadian border, if that doesn't even make any geographical sense. But like, yeah, I mean, this is in the 80s. We're talking about East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there are old Russian generals in a smoky room talking about a new military offensive, and it's literally taking hot young boys and sending them in to seduce secretaries. That is the fucking the sharpened spear point of their military operation. That's what the military looks like now, right? And it hasn't changed. I mean, it's changed, but it hasn't gone back to the way it was. It's gone even farther afield than that. This was 40 years ago. So, but it is hilarious that's like can you imagine the guys in the Pentagon, and it's like, we need to get these incels.
Well, that's my thing. By this point in their history, they were throwing a lot of shit at the wall, because I mentioned the Magnificent Five. The glory days of spies are over. They still have a lot of this great infrastructure, but the passion is lost. There's no heroes being made in the KGB, and they're recruiting. The type of person they're recruiting on the ground isn't someone who necessarily believes in the Soviet Union or communism as much as they hate America, or, you know what I mean? Which is a different type of personality that I don't think they're getting a new type of mad dog that they don't really know how to control, which is why they had such a high turnover rate. Here's another funny story that I got. So there was a lot of interest in infiltrating during the Red Scare, specifically infiltrating America through Canada, because and later on they're actually, like we talk about what America and various other countries are doing, they were supporting terrorist groups throughout this time. Like the Soviet Union was sponsoring the FLQ at the time. They were sponsoring directly. They were sponsoring stuff like the Weather Underground and a lot of these groups, sending money, having contacts, and sometimes they would cut off contact. But you're dealing with people who would fall off a lot. So one story was there's this a couple, like 4 or 5 guys in Canada, mainly Ontario, but also in Quebec, who they had trying to start a movement to get in through that border. And there's this one guy, just to show you how farcical it got by this point. This guy, he was in the military, or I don't know if he was in the military. Yeah, I think he was. But his thing was he was having an affair with the wife of this high-ranking military guy, and that's how he was getting information. But here's the problem. He fell in love with her, like really. And then she called off the affair. And then he just fell into degenerate alcoholism. So... And then, like, he was just going around fucking things up. And here's a funny thing that happened in Canada specifically. There was multiple times where these spies, these illegals, were contacting they got too drunk or something, and they would contact like the Ottawa press or the Toronto press, and they would say, "I'm a communist spy. I got a story for you," and they would just say, "Fuck off." It was just, there was multiple times, and they have evidence where they tried to do that, and then they were like, "Yeah, whatever." I'm like, you turned down the ability to break a subversive communist thing. So the joke was that they tried to infiltrate through Canada, but everyone was too horny and drunk to get it done.
That's the reputation that I want. Canadians are horny and drunk and cannot be trusted.
Yeah. And we talked, so I'm going to just kind of cut this off. There's a couple things I want to talk about, but really there's stories for days. It's a great book. There's all kinds of anecdotes. It goes into sources. It's written as if it's it's these scenarios, and it's a history book. So it's like, here's who did what at what point, and sometimes it ends in comedies. Sometimes it ends in, it details a lot about Stalin trying to assassinate and eventually assassinate Trotsky. How Trotsky was exiled and was living, I think, in Cuba or somewhere in South America at the time, and they saw, like, obsessed with Trotsky, who was a Marxist, but was the wrong type of Marxist. And then he was gathering up his own kind of version of Marxism, and Stalin was so into the purges and the terror, and they eventually killed him. But that's just an example of the internal terrors that were going on. But just one thing I want to bring, what the main point when I bring this up to leftists that I talk to, because I'm in these leftist chats, and I've gotten into not arguments, but just maybe heated exchanges where they refuse to believe anything exists. And I noticed this with Solzhenitsyn, because Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago got a real big bump with Jordan Peterson. He brought a lot of new eyes around that. Oh, yeah. And what I saw when, like, a lot of leftists and these kind of dirtbag left types were just saying it's lies. He's just lying. It's bullshit. It's total American fabrication. They refuse to admit it's even possible that it's true. And they did the same thing with this. So I'm talking to these left, like guys with the avatar of the USSR who really want to kill their landlords. And like I'm giving them quotes. I'm like, here's the page number from this book. It's sourced from internal Soviet documents. Here's the name, here's the date, here's the page number. And it's just, no, bullshit. You didn't read. I had a guy just tell me, you didn't read the fucking book. I'm like, I as I was reading, I'm like,
I just read it. I have it in front of me. It's hardcover. I have it right here. What the fuck are you talking?
Yeah,
though.
And they'll say, no, you read it wrong. You read it like, but it's unique with them. And the ultimate argument I was trying to make with them was, because they'll try and dunk on you by saying something along the lines of, the Soviet Union lasted longer than the Third Reich. We outlived fascism. And what I would counter with, and this isn't necessarily a defense, this isn't a defense of Nazi Germany, because there was other fascist countries too. But the idea was, fascism failed because the entire world united against it to destroy it. Communism failed because it dissolved over time and no one liked it. So this book is full of stories about how they would try and subvert. They had, in the Soviet bloc nations, they had to constantly try and crush nationalist uprisings. So even within the countries that they owned militarily, there were like Polish and Ukrainian nationalist uprisings. And there's entire wars they fought to try and take over this shit. And they had to crush them militarily or assassinate them. But there's this concept of Eurocommunism. Now, Eurocommunism was them trying to kick off in Western Europe. This would have been in France, Britain, all those other places where they had communist parties that were pretty successful. But over time, marking the near end of the Soviet Union was that they were transferring more to socialism, because over time they could not counter the nationalist desires of these countries. So socialism, as you see it now, the Communist parties just dissolved and became socialist because, like, okay, we like some of what you're saying, but we still need our national identity, and we need something that is more not so economically communism. They withdrew from Communist International. By the way, a lot of these leftists won't believe that Communist International exists. It's a real thing. It had a name. It was the idea of spreading communism worldwide. It was a real fucking thing. And the fall of the Soviet Union, the word fall is important because it was defined by people backing away from the table. Even modern communist states like China are a pale version of what the Soviet Union wanted the communists to be. Now it's kind of like a mishmash of kind of democracy, kind of socialism, kind of capitalism, and that's what all of it is. It's this.
Well, I think the Chinese example is so perfect for that because they have so effortlessly integrated nationalism into their communism, and it's why, I mean, here the locals here all call the Chinese government Nazis. Like, it's very common for them to just call the Chinese government Nazis because what are they? They're national socialists. They have a socialist government, but they're nationalist. All they care about is China and the Han ethnic Chinese ethnicity, right? So it's very it's somewhat on the nose, but that's absolutely what happened, and it's hilarious that they would deny that it was different before.
And that's the thing. So when you talk about this, like, you have to realize that they would look at China, they would look at Cuba as failures of communism because they are too ethno-nationalist in that sense. They
Yeah,
love their borders, love their national identity. That is the ultimate failure of Marxism and communism, because it
yeah,
was
yeah.
supposed to address all of this. So when you talk about the fall of communism and Marxism, it fell under its own weight, and that's why they saw their primary enemies as nationalists. Fascist was a different branding, because they just saw fascism as an offshoot of nationalism. So the fact that the reason these countries survive because of nationalism and pretty aggressive ethno
Yeah, yeah.
nationalism is a total rebuke of what they're trying to fight for, which is interesting. So always remember that it failed, and they will try and tell you a story where the Soviet Union fell because America won their big fist fight. Not really. Like this big fist fight was instigated by the Soviet Union, by their spy infrastructure, by all these missions and special actions and everything. And it was ended because, especially the Soviet bloc countries, said, "This fucking sucks. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't like
The
you. I don't like what's going on."
the Cold War was a drunk fight, right? Where the big Russian guy at the bar started picking on and fronting to the American guy with all his friends there. But as the night wore on and he refused to actually throw a fucking punch, his friends slowly started leaving, and he became so drunk that he started hitting the chair and hitting the bar and then falling over, and then he died of alcohol poisoning while the American laughed. That was the
Yeah.
Cold War.
Yeah. And really, the one thing I want to end on, because I do have to get going like right after this, but we talked about this on a previous podcast, but I really want to mention this, that Soviets will tell a story that the reason genocide occurs, or the pathway to genocide rather, is due to dehumanization of your enemy. And I think it's the opposite, because that's a very Soviet, very worker obsessed way of, like, the worst thing in the world would be an assembly line, a soulless assembly line of murder. It's like, no. But if you look at every other genocide that's ever been perpetrated in various countries, genocide occurs when you viscerally hate your opponent. So you need to understand that, when they accuse the Nazis of the mechanization of they saw genocide as like a bourgeois thing. That's what they accuse. That's their whole mythology about Nazi Germany. But in reality, to perpetuate a genocide and to get away with the tortures and the gulags and all this shit, you need to view your enemy as someone you actually hate and want to do harm to. It's not seeing them as an animal. It's seeing them as a person you want to do harm to. And I think that's where the Soviet Union and a lot of these communists, the bread tubers like we get right now, the vitriol they have towards their enemy is, way worse. Like a lot of even the worst guys on the far right, they just want to say, fuck, I want to ship you away. These people want to kill you. They want to get in there and they want to watch you hang. So like, remember that. Remember, no matter what they tell you, they're going to tell you it's all lies. They're going to tell you the entire failure was because of America being jealous, which is what everyone's going to think we're so awesome, they're going to try and kill us because we're jealous. That's not it at all. It fell under its own weight. It dissolved slowly over time. The first thing that dissolved was the spectacle of the Soviet system, which at a time was new and interesting, and that's why they had to change their tactics, the KGB, over time, to like, let's just blow up dams just to just to hurt them a little bit. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say. Any last points? Because I really do have to get going right now.
No,
Kind of
no,
went over.
no. We're good. We're good. We're gonna. I think as this bleeds into Das Kapital, we'll probably continue the conversation in the next couple.
Yeah, but again, check the book. There's stories for days about stuff like this, about relationships and people betraying each other, and it reads like a spy novel. Like these spy novels were based off of things that happened, up to and including trying to seduce these women.